You're going to be hearing a lot about undocumented immigrants in the next few years, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of farm labor in the United States. Let's get into it. I think a lot about immigration. I know a lot about immigration. I'm interested in immigration, and it's going to be a hot button topic in this administration. So it is my desire to counter whatever misinformation may be coming from the administration with some good historical information about immigration and what it has looked like in the United States. But I'd like to focus this particular video on farm workers. I may try and make it a series. Let me know in the comments if that's something you would be interested in. Farm labor has always been a difficult economic problem. Farming for cash crops, that is, not just for subsistence, although that's difficult in itself, but farming for cash, like having enough surplus so that you can sell it to make money to buy the goods that you and your family need. It's a business that has very narrow margins, and it's very boom and bust. It depends on the weather, it depends on the skill that you have in maintaining your soil, it depends on whether you have access to your neighbor's bees. It's a difficult and capricious business to be in, and the profit margins are very small. And because of this, the labor needed to harvest that crop has always been under a lot of pressure to be underpaid because the profit margins are so small. And that labor force is, by its very nature, seasonal. So you, as the farmer, may not be able to keep your farm hands paid all year round because you only really need them for the month and a half that crop is being harvested. So it's seasonal. There's a lot of wage pressures coming from the profit margins of that business model to keep those wages low. And historically, the owners of the farms, the landowners or the property owners or the farmers, have dealt with this problem of keeping farm worker wages low by slavery in its various forms, like bonded slavery, like with serfdom, where they had some rights but were tied specifically to the land. With chattel slavery in the South, the cash crops that they farmed in the southern United States were mostly cotton, but also some tobacco, also some sugar cane, and also some rice. These big cash crops were dependent upon this free labor. Now, over the centuries, farming techniques improve. There are the inventions of new fertilizers, new pesticides, and the tractor, which revolutionizes the way that farms are worked in the United States and around the world. And other kinds of farm equipment come along that are also incredibly useful to helping farmers get these cash crops harvested, planted, harvested, tended to. But these inventions make farming more expensive, make your overhead higher. If you want to buy a tractor, I've already discussed that the margins of farming are really, really tight. So if you want to buy a tractor, you might have to take out a loan for that. You're still not having any extra money. And if your neighbor bought a tractor and they're able to harvest XYZ amount, you're trying to compete with them. You can't do it unless you have the tractor. So even as technology in farming improves, there's still a lot of downward pressure on those wages from the point of view of the people who are running the farm. On top of that, because farming starts to get more and more expensive, and people who used to work on farms are frustrated with the low margins and the precariousness and the capriciousness of that business, they cannot no longer sustain it. And so a lot of times people will abandon farms, will sell their farms, will move to cities to work for wage labor, just to find other opportunities. And those farms will be bought by larger and larger agribusinesses who eat up those farms, and they're using the mechanized tools to farm these larger pieces of land. But when they do need hands for the harvest, because there are some things that it's still worth it for these larger businesses to pay people to do, it's seasonal. And back when it was a bunch of family farms within a community, when the seasonal labor time happened, the community would rally together and it would be all hands on deck, and people would, if they would call on their cousin who lived in the city to come back for the harvest for a month, and they would, get their kids out of school. And that's why we have summer break, and that's why we start school in the fall. It's after the harvest in most of the country, because the kids would be harvesting. So the community would draw on everyone to fulfill these seasonal harvests. Well, once the agribusiness comes in, it's no longer a family farm. There's no longer that community of labor to draw on. And so it's now labor needs that are very remote from where there are people to do this labor. So that's when this seasonal migrant labor force comes into play. Now, because farm labor is typically underpaid, because farm labor is very, very difficult physically, and because it is seasonal, which means that it is piecework, it is unstable, it tends to be done by people who have few other options, because it's just not steady work. If you have the option to get a job that's going to pay you the same wage year round, you are likely to take that. Now, of course, there are some very highly skilled farm workers. There's a lot of them. This is not an unskilled labor necessarily. There are people who make a living just doing the pruning of the grapevines here in California, because it's a very specialized skill. There's a lot of education that goes into that. So I don't mean to dismiss the knowledge of farm laborers at all. However, there's a lot of farm labor that is not highly skilled, and it is done by people who are on sort of the margins of society. And so because there are these agribusinesses that are located away from sources of labor, and they need seasonal work, but it's not year-round, there have, over the years, been many points at which these farmers would import laborers from other countries. And in the 1850s, when immigration laws were relatively loose in the United States, they were importing them from Ireland, they were importing them from China and Japan, they were importing them from Mexico, they were importing them from the poorer parts of Europe, they're importing them from all over the place. And after the Civil War, they were also bringing in former enslaved people to do farm labor, as well as Native Americans were also doing farm labor. And it would be very, very difficult for the folks who were doing this labor. It was really, really tough. It was physically demanding. And again, those wage pressures meant that when the farmers and the agribusinesses who were hiring these folks could exploit them and not pay them enough to live on, and not give them decent places to live, and not feed them well, and ask them to work 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day in, heat that would make them sick, under conditions that would make them sick. If they could do that, they would, because the economic pressures were such that they would do that. This is just the reality. And the fact that these were immigrants made them a bit more vulnerable, because they didn't have access to some of the they didn't have access to citizenship, they didn't have voting rights, they didn't have as much of a voice as some other folks. But these were all immigrants who were here legally. And so over time, they would organize, they would gain citizenship, they would gain a voice, and they would strike, and they would do what they could to organize. Now I'm going to come back, because I have a lot more to say about this. I'm going to come back with a part 2 on farm laborers in the US.